Welcome to Philippians chapter 2. Tonight is all about the Christ hymn. All about the Christ hymn. We left a few verses at the end of chapter 1 last week because I said it leads into chapter 2. It leads into the Christ hymn. There's several verses that lead into it. Then there's the Christ hymn itself. And then there's a few verses after it that we'll talk about. And then the very end of chapter 2, we're going to leave that for when we discuss chapter 3 next week. The two paragraphs, one on Timothy and one on Epaphroditus. We're going to talk about that next week. So everything tonight is either a lead-in, the Christ hymn, or the after effect of what Paul wants to talk about with the Christ hymn. It's beautiful. We'll go through the Christ hymn actually 3 separate times. In different ways. We're also going to see, if you remember the teaser that I did at the very end last week, I said that Paul is going to use a key part of first century Greek culture to help us understand our relationship with God better. You remember that teaser? I'm going to hopefully fulfill that teaser tonight as we go through this, the third time we go through the hymn. To do a very, very quick recap on 3 things that we talked about last week, just so that they're sort of fresh in our mind as we move into this. First of all, Paul calls himself a slave or a servant. The Greek word that is translated as slave or servant is the same word, so it's up to the translator whether it's slave or servant. But Paul refers to him and Timothy as servants or as slaves. Number 2, Paul reveals his humility. And he did that, if you recall, when he's in prison and people are afflicting him and he's saying, no problem. Christ is being proclaimed, so I rejoice. That shows what his priority is, and therefore that shows what his humility is. That's going to factor in a little bit. And then third, we talked about that infinite gap between God and man. Actually, we didn't go into infinity last week. We just talked about big gap, right? Because it's really hard to wrap your heads around infinity. But we talked about a big gap. How do we bridge that gulf? And how do we look at that properly so that we analyze the right things at the right time, so that we understand where our pride comes from, where our humility comes from, where our self-esteem comes from. So we're analyzing different things, and all of it had to do with the fact that God is so much bigger than us, which is an understatement. He's infinite, but I won't go back into the infinity conversation. Okay, so those are the 3 things I just wanted to touch on, so that if you were here last week or if you watched the video, those 3 things should be in our mind as we move forward. So, as we move forward, we get into the text. These are the last few verses that we left off from chapter 1. Paul says, only conduct yourselves in a way worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or I'm absent, I may hear news of you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, struggling together for the faith of the gospel, not intimidated in any way by your opponents. This is proof to them of destruction, but of your salvation. And this is God's doing. First thing, I'm just going to touch on the opponents. Nobody really knows what the opponents are. There's 2 good guesses. One is the Philippians, the community that Paul is talking to, is the Christian community of Philippians, but there are other Philippians. There is a pagan community. So that could be it. And Paul has had problems with the pagan community of Philippians. If you read through Acts, he's had some problems. So that could be the opponents. The other thing could be, and it relates to what we talked about last week, that Philippi is a Roman colony. So as such, there are certain things that happen. The emperor can award plots of land to high-ranking military officers as they retire. So Philippi is likely dotted with a bunch of ex-military officers whose allegiance is to their deity, which is the emperor. So with this Christian community growing, that could end up being some strain. So those could be the opponents. But as the Christian community grows, it's proof to them of their destruction, but of your salvation. And Paul reminds the Philippians, it's not your doing, it's God's doing. Always comes back to that, has to do with the humility and remembering this monster difference between us and God. But let me go back to the top. Only conduct yourselves in a way worthy of the gospel. Conduct yourselves, the Greek word that gets translated as conduct yourselves, is a term very close to citizenship. I can't remember. There's many syllables to it, and I can't remember. But it starts with basically politics. So remember last week I said the Philippians, because they're a Roman colony and because Roman citizenship is so important to all sorts of statuses, they're obsessed with the concept of citizenship. So Paul is using a term that is translated for us as conduct yourselves, but it really means be a good citizen, okay? But Paul is not talking about being a good Roman citizen. He's talking about being a good citizen of the kingdom of heaven. And the Philippians know this, but he's using the concept of citizenship because it's so ingrained in them, it captures their attention. So if we don't know the texture behind those two words, conduct yourselves, we'd miss a little bit of what Paul's doing to the Philippians, is saying, pay close attention. This is really important to you. You've been trained for this your whole life, to pay attention to this word. And it's closely related to our word politics. Conduct yourselves in a way worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent. If you recall last week, Paul is in prison writing this. He doesn't know if he's going to make it out or be killed, or he doesn't know if he's ever going to be able to see the Philippians. He is hopeful through the letter that I hope to come see you again, but he's also realistic, saying this might be my last time in prison. And we don't know, standing here today or whenever, we don't know if this letter was written and he did get out and see the Philippians again, or if this was the last time he was in prison before he was martyred. We don't know that. But he's indicating here, I'm not in control of my circumstance here. So I may see you, I may be absent. And whether I come and see you or I'm absent, I'm hoping to hear news of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, struggling together for the faith of the gospel. This is going to be my first tangent for the night. And I just have to do this because this phrase immediately reminded me of another Sunday reading with this same idea of one spirit, one mind. And before I get to the other reading, Paul is addressing them as both a community as a whole and as individuals. So we each have things, if you're honest, we each have things that we need to work on individually. But then there's also things, if we're thinking together also as a community, there's things that we need to work on collectively. So both of those things he's talking about here. So Paul preaches unity above all else. If you were here at the Ephesians study, we did a whole section talking about how important it is that for Paul that we not only all share faith, but we share the same faith, that we understand the faith the same way, that unity of thought so that we're together, so that it forms those strong bonds. So that's where it's important to him to have the same spirit, same mind, one spirit, one mind. So here's the tangent. It's important to understand unity the right way. In Acts chapter 4, verse 32 through 37, it's one of the Sunday readings that we get to throughout the year. In Acts 4, 32 through 37, Luke is writing about the early Christian community and how they're conducting themselves. So he says, now the company of I'm going to read some of this and I'm going to paraphrase some of this so I don't have to go through the whole thing. Now the company of those who believed were of one heart and soul. That's what got me off on this tangent. It's the same phrase, okay? Different author, same phrase. The company of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had everything in common. And then he goes on to explain that those who had land and houses and possessions, they went off and sold them and brought the money, gave it to the apostles, and then the apostles took care of the community by distributing as everyone needed. So it goes on, it says, there was not a needy person among them, for as many who are possessors of land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made to each as any had need. And it goes on from there. Passages like these are not biblically endorsed advertisements for socialism. And some people can understand it that way. And it's important that we understand unity the right way. Because it's very close, if you know the mantra of socialism, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It sounds very close to what I just read, right? If you had possessions, you went and sold them. From each according to their ability, and to each according to their need. It sounds very close, but this is not what this is. There are some very clever people out there who like to take, especially to take things from the Bible and twist it and leave certain things out so that it's very, very close to what God says, but they leave out a key part. Or they add something in and they twist it a little bit. And they get people with good minds, good hearts and minds to go along with it because it sounds so close to what God is saying. But this is not what God is saying. We need to know better. We need to think things through. Here's the difference. The description that's in Acts 4 is of a community of like-minded believers who voluntarily share what they own. There's no coercion, there's no taxation, there's no threatening. It's a voluntary process. They're all like-minded, and they can see whether or not the distribution is happening justly because it's local. It's verifiable. It's a big difference between a large thing becoming imposed and having this under compulsion. In fact, there would be no way that what we just described would be charitable if it was under compulsion, because it would remove our free will. Free will, one of my very favorite topics, and if I get off on this, we'll go forever, so I'm not going to do that. But free will is an incredible gift from God. And our free will is the only thing that allows us to love, allows us to do good acts or bad acts. If we don't have free will, anything we do, nothing we do can be called a good act or a bad act. Everything that was just very admirable in what I just read wouldn't be a good act. It would just be what they had to do. So, and for anything to be a good work, it needs to be a loving, voluntary act. No one has the authority to force our free will. Think about this. Even God does not force our free will. He gives us our free will and allows us, if we are so silly, to use it against him. He even doesn't step in. So there's a huge difference between the people that would take something like that and leave off this one little piece of information like free will and use it for a political agenda. Now, I don't mean to be on a political soapbox. I'm on a truth soapbox. It's really important to me that nobody twists God's word. So I go off on that tangent because every once in a while I have to read that at Mass, and it's like, I want to explain this, but I'm not allowed to. So thank you for being here tonight. I've gotten it off my chest. Next time we read that at Mass, everybody sort of tap at the person next to me. Listen, let me tell you, remember free will. So, you're going to be my mouthpiece the next time this happens. Anyway, that's it. That's the end of my soapbox. We now get back to Philippians. I apologize for the tangent, but for me, it's important to do that. Getting back to Philippians. Next, we're still in chapter 1. We haven't gotten to chapter 2 yet. For to you has been granted, for the sake of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. Now, I hate to do this. This is the second tangent. These are the only two tangents for the night. They happen to come right at the beginning, because that's where the words come in. For you it has been granted for the sake of Christ, not only to believe in him. Now, that's a phrase that I happen to love because it occurs in one of my favorite Bible verses of all time, one of the most popular Bible verses of all time. What's the most popular Bible verse of all time? John 3:16. Exactly. So believe in him. John 3:16, believes in him. It's the same phrase. It's the same Greek words. And for those of you who were here for Ephesians, I'm going to ask you to cut me a little slack. I'm going to go off and explain what I did in Ephesians for about 5 minutes, just so that we're all on the same page, because I love this and I love this concept. So, John 3:16 is the gospel in miniature. It's 4 little sections there, and God's responsible for doing 3 of those 4 things. He loves the world, he gave his son, and if we believe, that's our part, will not perish but will have eternal life. I trust God to do his part. So I'm not worried about those 3. I'm worried about my part. I'm worried about whether or not I believe. And it sounds like that would be simple to do. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. The demons believe that, and they're not going to heaven. Believe means something a little bit more than I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It means more than that. We need to understand. Our salvation depends on whether or not we understand that word properly, which is why I'm going off on this and asking the folks that were at Ephesians to give me a couple of minutes slack here. So, what does believes mean if it doesn't mean I believe that he's the Son of God? What does it mean? Well, to understand that, we go to the Greek. This is the big Greek word of the day. There'll be a couple of others, but this is the only one I'm going to put on the screen. Pisteuon. The word that is translated as believes, the Greek word is pisteuon. And it has a bit more texture to it than just believe, to intellectually agree to a fact. It means more than that. And it means more than that because we are made up of more than just our intellect. We are made up of intellect and will. So our intellect, our rational decision making, we look at things, we look at the evidence, we figure out whether or not we believe or not, we agree or not agree, or assent or not assent to an intellectual fact. But then our will is responsible for something else, and this has to come into play too. Our will handles things like decisions and actions and emotions and desires and motivation. It's where love and faith and caring comes from. So our will has to be involved in the full definition of the word believe. So it's not just intellectual assent, but also entrusting oneself to the Son. So if we entrust ourselves to the Son, that's another way that's another very valid way to translate pisteuon, which is normally we hear believes in him. But we're going to get a deeper understanding of that word believes, because that's how we get to heaven. So it would be valid to say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever entrusts themselves to him or to his message should not perish but have eternal life. That would be a very valid translation. Another way to, before I get into it, I chose the word entrust. Some people like the word submit or surrender to Jesus or to his message. And those are perfectly valid words. Those are perfectly acceptable words. For me, I'm a stickler for words. I like the word entrust because you could submit or surrender to a tyrant if you were forced to do so. But you only entrust yourself to someone who you know is on your side. So that's why I use the word entrust. Surrender and submit are perfectly fine as long as you're thinking in the right direction. God is not making you submit. You are voluntarily submitting. But if you just say the word entrust, it takes care of it. So that's why I do that. So that was a tangent within a tangent. Okay? The other way two more ways. Another way to translate pisteuon is to say, whoever has been persuaded by the Son. Now this one's pretty obvious. If someone has persuaded you, you believe them, right? If Jesus was not successful at persuading us, we didn't believe him. So that ability to persuade, or that our ability to be persuaded, is part of that belief. And the third one takes a little bit of explanation and a little bit of historical background. When we think about learning something from someone in today's world, we think about the teacher-student relationship. You're going to learn economics. So you sign up for a course on economics, and on such and such a day, at such and such an hour, you show up for an hour or two, and you learn economics from this professor. And for an hour or two, you listen, you take notes, and the next week you do it again, the next week you do it again, and several weeks later you're done with the course, and that's it. You're finished with that teacher. That's the teacher-student relationship. You've learned a chunk of what that person happens to be skilled at, and that's the teacher-student relationship. Back in Paul's day, it was a rabbi-disciple relationship. And while it is similar, it goes a lot deeper. In a rabbi-disciple relationship, you didn't want to just learn something that person happened to know, that one particular aspect of the world that they knew. You wanted to know everything that they thought about everything. You really wanted to learn their whole mind. You wanted to just sit at their feet 24/7 and just hear them talk about every topic under the sun. You wanted to pattern your mind after their mind. That's how much you looked at them and said, I just want to copy the way you think. So in Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 29, Jesus refers to this. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now, I don't know how many farmers there are in the room, and whether or not we all know what a yoke is. Those of you that were in Ephesians, you know what this is, right? It's that big wooden thing that looks like a big M that you would put over the backs or the shoulders of, let's say, a team of oxen. So you've got two oxen pulling a cart. It's very bad for the cart if the oxen decide to pull in opposite directions. It just tears the cart apart. So you need to have them pulling in the same direction. So you have a yoke that connects them. Once they're in that yoke, the oxen are pointed in the same direction. Now think about this. The oxen now see the world the same way as each other, right? Because they're pointed in the same direction. So when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, he's saying, see the world the way I see the world. A lot of tonight is going to be talking about putting on the mind of Christ. That's what he's talking about here. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. So a disciple wants to take on the entire worldview of the rabbi or the teacher. We, as disciples of Jesus, want to take on the entire worldview of the Son. That's the third way to translate this. Pistuon could be saying, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever adopts his worldview should not perish, but have eternal life. So that's the three ways we could translate pistuon. But I'm going to add a little punctuation mark here because it goes just one step further, and this is an analogy that I came up with to try and drive that third part home. Imagine a father and son, a human father and son. We're not talking about the father and son here, divine. A human father and son. This is a father who loves his son, a father who's very skilled and very successful at various areas in life, and he wants to pass along information, pass along wisdom to his son as he's growing up. The son, on the other hand, adores his father and he just sort of drinks this in. And the father, all through the years he's growing up, is constantly giving out little pieces of wisdom. Do this, show up to work early, do a firm handshake, but not too firm, and this and that. Go the extra mile, which comes from Jesus anyway. But constantly giving those. I mean, you can picture this, right? Constantly giving little pieces of wisdom over a course of years to his son, in the hopes that the son will take it and model his life after that, because the father knows that if he does, it will be the most successful possible life for him. Now the question becomes, let's say you take that the son aside in his teens at some point and you say, do you remember what your father taught you? Remember, there's all sorts of things. And let's say the son has just a tremendous memory, just a wonderful memory, and he can literally recite back every last little piece of wisdom that the father has told him over the years. He literally can just recite the whole thing back. So he knows the father's worldview. Does that prove that he believes it? He just knows it. So I ask you, how do we know? How does the father know? How does the child himself know when he believes what he has been taught? When do we find that out? When he lives it, yes. I heard murmurings of different things, but when he's out from underneath his father's household and he actually does those things that he's been told, this will be the most successful life, this will be the best possible life. When he actually does them is the first time we'll ever know whether or not he truly has adopted the worldview of the Father. Our actions, the way we live our life, is our faith. It is our faith. We can memorize all the scripture verses we want. We could have the whole catechism at our fingertips. Doesn't mean we believe it. If we live it, it means that we actually have believed it and we realize that's the best way to live. That's believing. All of that was to give you more texture to that word believe. Did it give you more texture? Okay, good. So that's that. Now we get back to Philippians, and those are the only two long tangents that I've got for the evening. At this point, we just stick with Philippians. Okay. Back to here. So for to you has been granted for the sake of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. That's not a word I need to explain. We know what that means. There's various extents of that, but we know what suffering means. Now, back then, Christians sometimes suffered at the hands of the authorities because they were bringing God's message into a pagan world or into a non-Christian world, and the authorities didn't like that. Good thing we don't live in a society like that anymore. We're at that same place today. So the question becomes, are we willing to suffer for the name? Are we willing to suffer to bring God's truth into the world? And in today's world, suffering generally means that, you're going to be laughed at on Facebook. It's not quite the same as what the Christians did back then, which I won't even get into all the stuff. But, you can think about lions and gladiators all you want. There's worse than that. We don't have to go through that, but we might have to stand up and say, no, this is God's truth. That's not. This is truth. Are we willing to suffer the unbearable humiliation of a bad comment on our Facebook feed? That's the question. We believe in him, but we also might need to suffer for him. Yours is the same struggle as you saw in me and now hear about me. That word struggle, which was also in the last slide, that word struggle, Paul loves athletic metaphors and athletic words. It works for him to explain it. And many of the communities are very into athletics. Think about ancient Greeks and Olympics and all that stuff. So the word that is translated as struggle means like struggling in an athletic contest, like a wrestling match. The Greek word is agon, A-G-O-N, where we get agony from. So a struggle is an agony, especially if you're matched against somebody else wrestling who has got you beat. So that struggle is, and he's always using, first he was talking about, he's alluding to citizenship because he knows that's going to bring him in. He's alluding now to sports because he knows that's going to bring them in. There's also an athletic sin athleo, being of the same struggle somewhere in here. Another athletic thing, but I can't remember where it is. So, moving on, we're in chapter 2. We've made it to chapter 2. Trust me, we got plenty of time. So, chapter 2, Paul starts talking. The first two lines up here, the different translations leave in the full extent of what Paul is saying. Paul uses the word if at the beginning of each of these little sections. So he's saying, and this translation, the NAB, leaves it out, so it's not quite as intense. But Paul is saying this: if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there's any solace in love, if any participation in the Spirit, if any compassion and mercy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, with the same love, united in heart, thinking one thing. Now first, all of those ifs are just hyperbole. Paul's just going overboard. He knows the Philippians don't need to be talk to this strongly. They love each other. The Philippians love Paul. Paul loves the Philippians. Anything Paul says, they're going to drink in. But he's making the point because he knows he's just like 2 or 3 verses away from the Christ hymn. And he really wants to get their attention. So he goes, if, please complete my joy by being of the same mind, with the same love, united in heart, thinking one thing. Now, if you were here last week or if you watched the video, you may realize that all 4 of those underlined things are thinking things. They're not feeling things. It's not like 2 thinking things and 2 feeling things, right? Same mind, that's obviously thinking. Same love. What did we talk about last week? Love, agape love, the highest love, is seeking the highest good for the other. That's a thinking thing, because you need to figure out what the highest good is. You need to use your rational mind to think about what are the long-term consequences. So that's a thinking thing. Same love is a thinking thing. United in heart. Back in those times, where did you think? With your heart, right? We said heart, gut, and now it's up to here, right? So, and then thinking one thing, that's obviously a thinking thing. So Paul is saying in 4 slightly different, very poetic ways, take on the mind of Christ. I'm about to show it to you. Take on the mind of Christ. And he's just using a little bit of extra poetry to make his point. So, where we get, and hold on, wait. Oh, it's next line. The next one is, do nothing out of selfishness or vainglory. That's vanity. Rather, humbly regard others as more important than yourselves. There is no way in the world I could adequately emphasize how important that line is. That is a core part of putting on the mind of Christ. Humbly regarding others as more important than yourself. If you're at Ephesians, we talked about the mutual subordination of husband and wife. The subordination meaning, does anybody remember their ordinal numbers from math? What are ordinal numbers, right? Integers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ordinal numbers are first, second, third, fourth, fifth. So it's place. It's where do you place? First, second, third, fourth, fifth. So subordination is always making sure that you do not place yourself first. You place others first. So the mutual subordination of husband and wife, which we talked about in Ephesians, and if you wanted details on that, I'll send you the link. Because I go into it at length. But he's bringing up that concept here without using that word. So that he's saying, subordinate yourself to others. Always think of them as more important than yourselves. Think about Jesus' life. That's what he did. So there's no way to emphasize this as much as I possibly could, but I gave it my best shot. Now, there's a different section here. So now we're going to get to the actual Christ hymn. And the first time we go through the Christ hymn, I'm just going to go through it at speed. We're not going to stop at different words and explain things. We're just going to go through it and just absorb it. I'm going to read it with a little bit of a strong voice, as if I was proclaiming it at Mass, and just sort of take it in. Then we're going to go back through it again right away and start picking it apart and getting into some of the details. But just absorb this as poetry, which is what it is, plus an incredible theological exploration of the incarnation and of the ascension and all sorts of different things. I won't talk it up too much. Let's get to it. So here, it's going to be in 2 separate slides. Have among yourselves the same attitude that is also yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, coming in human likeness. And, found human in appearance, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Because of this, God greatly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, of those in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's the Christ hymn. It gets me every time I go through it. I just love it. Now let's go through and pick apart some things, because there's more beauty in this and more profound stuff in here than you could possibly imagine. I hate using the word stuff because it's so bad, but whatever. There's good stuff in here, guys. So, have among yourselves the same attitude that is also yours in Christ Jesus. The word that's translated as attitude is phroneo. It means mind. For some reason, somebody decided to have the same attitude as Christ. What that line is saying is, take on the mind of Christ. Paul is saying, what's on the screen right now? He wouldn't say that because he didn't know what screens were, but he's saying, what's on the screen right now? That's the mind of Christ. Take this on. This is what I'm asking you to do. I'm not just asking you to be united in one mind. I'm asking you to be united in the one mind. I'm not asking you to take on my mindset, Paul. I'm asking you to take on Christ's mindset. And here I'm going to describe it to you here. That is also yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. That word grasped. Every time I think about this, prior to putting these notes together and really digging in, I had come up with one way to understand that line. And I'm curious if anybody else happened to think this. I'm going to share with you a wrong understanding, but I'm going to share with you what I thought it was. And bear in mind, we were talking last week about the infinite difference between God and man and how hard it is to wrap our heads around that. So the way I looked at this, and I'm wrong, or was wrong, now I'm right. I was wrong, was who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God, because he's equal to God, something that we could possibly grasp. So he only shared it with a few apostles late in the ministry. He knew that we couldn't possibly grasp that huge difference. That's what I understood it to be, that we couldn't grasp it. But that's not what this means. Did anybody happen to have a similar understanding of that phrase? Okay. We're wrong. Sorry, but I'm with you, okay? This is what it means. That word grasped in Greek is harpagmon. And outside of the Bible, because it's only used, I think, twice in the Bible, outside of the Bible in ancient Greek literature, that word harpagmon means robbery, to steal something. And you can see where that grasped comes from, right? You grasp something, you steal it. That's robbery. In the full context of what's going on here, what's being said is, who, though he was in the form of God, having supreme and utter authority, he did not regard using that authority for his own to exploit it for personal gain. Even back then, people in positions of authority exploited their positions of authority for personal gain. They would say, you want this project done? I need a little bit of money. You want this done? You want to stay out of trouble? You need to get the point. Jesus is the one who has more authority and more power than anybody ever. And he chose not to use it, not to exploit it for personal gain. Rather, he emptied himself. He voluntarily left his power, much of his power, behind, or didn't use it while he was in his earthly ministry. He said, the incarnation, I'm becoming a man. So he emptied himself of that power. The Greek word is kanoo, which we get kenosis from, which means to empty yourself, to forego some of those things that are really yours, but you're letting it go. He emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. And about half of the translations use the word slave, about half of the translations use the word servant. I think I mentioned last week that word can be translated as either one. I would argue that really should be translated as servant instead of slave. Because the reason it can be translated as either one is it sort of means a worker in a household. The doulos means worker in a household. Now it could be a voluntary worker, a servant, or an involuntary worker, a slave. Is Christ working voluntarily or involuntarily here? I would argue that should be translated as servant. But you get the point. He's lowering himself. He's emptying himself. He could stay stronger than any military leader, any politician, any royalty, but instead he empties himself and takes the form of a common person, of a slave or a servant, coming in human likeness and found human in appearance. He humbled himself. Who did he humble himself to? the Father. He's humbling himself to the plan of the Father. And he becomes obedient to the point of death. I add the point of to make it clear what's meant there. Because if you're not careful, you could say that obedient to death means that because he's now man, death has control over him. He's obedient to death. Death can take him whenever he wants. And that's not true. So it's more accurate to say, become obedient to the point of death. That's really what the Greek means. And obedient to death, even death on a cross. But he's obedient. Think about the prayer that he says to the Father in Gethsemane. He says, paraphrasing, I don't want to do this. This doesn't sound like fun. Take this cup from me, but not my will, thy will be done. So even when he's struggling with this, he's obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Now, death on a cross is supremely humiliating and supremely painful. So to do that willingly is just the ultimate in service, the ultimate in sacrifice, the ultimate in obedience. And I just realized I don't even have my notes. I'm just sort of talking off the cuff here. It's the Romans were very good at making sure that nobody crossed them. So they set up these things that were very public, and crucifixion, and we still use that phrase now. You know, they're going to crucify him, right? It's a public thing. We're going to make an example of that person. We're going to crucify him. That's what happened there, except when they did it back then, it was extremely painful, extremely humiliating. And there's one particular word that I always find interesting. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a pain specialist because your shoulder's hurting, your back's hurting or whatever. A pain specialist or a doctor trying to figure out a pain is going to ask you certain questions to find out, well, what kind of pain is it and how strong is that pain? And they're going to ask, is it burning, is it stabbing, is it tingling, is it this? And then they're going to ask the gradations of how strong it is. And I can't remember all the words, but all the words they use to figure out how strong it is. But I do remember, and this is universal, this is absolutely true, this is universal in pain management. The very top word for the most pain you could possibly imagine is excruciating. That's the word. And if you know your Latin and you break that word apart, it means excruciate, from the cross. Even now, 2,000 years later, the word that we use to describe the worst pain we could possibly go through is the pain that Jesus went through for us on the cross, willingly. Excruciating. The next time you got a headache and you say, oh, this is excruciating, pick a different word. Just pick a different word. Out of respect, just pick a different word. Unless, of course, it's really excruciating, in which case, well, offer it up. Catholic, redemptive suffering. I'm not going off on that right now. So that's the first half of the hymn. Now, this describes what Jesus did. First, he crossed that infinite gap and he came down, became man, and went through all this and was obedient to death. And then the second slide here describes what God the Father did in response. Because of this, that's the response. These aren't two separate concepts. Because of this, because of what Jesus did, God greatly exalted him. Didn't just resurrect him, but there was the ascension, there's the enthronement. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father in heaven. He greatly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. The name. What is the name that is above every name? It's not Jesus. Jesus has had that name for the last 33 years. God the Father is doing this in response to what he just did. That was a good guess. And we're told to pray with the name of Jesus. There's nothing wrong with saying what you just said. The name of Jesus is powerful. But that's not what Paul's talking about here. So we have to be on the lookout for what that name is. There's a name. Yeah, I'm hearing it. We're not going there. I'm not going to acknowledge anything you just said right now. We're going to go through it at my pace. But some of you just got it right, okay? Bestowed on him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bend of those in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess. So every knee should bend and every tongue confess. Beautiful, but Paul didn't come up with this. This comes directly from Isaiah 45, verses 22 through 24. I am the Lord, there is no other. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. By myself I have sworn. From my mouth has gone forth in righteousness a word that shall not return. To me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear. Only in the Lord shall it be said of me are righteousness and strength. And he goes on, and the Lord goes on from there. So this comes from God back in the Old Testament. Those phrases, Paul's using that. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bend of those in heaven, whoops, wrong button, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. 3, Paul's making the point that it's not just humanity that will bend the knee to Jesus, but also the angels in heaven, both the demons in hell. Everyone will bend the knee to Jesus. That's what greatly exalted means. And in Old Testament times, under the earth also meant the deceased. So those who are alive, those who are dead, those in heaven, and those in the other place, in the underworld. Everyone is going to bend the knee and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. That's the name. That's the name. Because God himself described himself as Lord in the Old Testament. And now he's giving that name to Jesus, to the glory of God the Father. So that's the first that's the second pass through the Christ hymn. We're going to go through it one more time. But before we go through that, because I might forget this, like I said, I limited my talk tonight because if I went through every last facet of this, we'd be here for weeks. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to leave some time just to sort of discuss things afterward. But I would encourage you to take out your Bible tonight and go through these 6 or 7 verses and pray with it and ask God, please reveal something to me that we happen to miss tonight. Just open my eyes to that. What do you need me to hear? It's 6 or 7 verses. It won't take you very long. But there might be something that pops out that I didn't cover because I'm intentionally limiting myself. Now let me go through this one more time, the concept of it one more time. Because I promised you that Paul was going to use a key part of ancient Greek culture to give us a better understanding of our relationship with God. And here we go. We're going to go through the hymn again mentally as I walk through this. So we're going to be talking about Greek culture here for a sec. The cornerstone of Greek culture was friendship. We all like having friends. It's part of our culture. But it's not like it was in ancient Greece. It was the thing to aspire to, not just to have friends. But friendship was so key. It held communities together. It held civilization together as far as they were concerned. Everything worked properly because of friendship. And the highest thing you could possibly aspire to in ancient Greece was to equip yourselves, to learn the virtues that made you a good friend. That was the number one goal in life, was to acquire those gifts, those virtues, so that you could be a good friend. And this was based, this obsession with friendship was based a lot on the writing of 2 very important Greek philosophers. You know them, Plato and Aristotle, okay? We might not know them because we don't read them in school anymore, but you know who they are, right? Mr. Peabody in the Wayback Machine told us about Plato and Aristotle. I'm guessing they probably left something out because it was a short cartoon, but you get the point. I didn't mean to go off on that, sorry. So both Plato and Aristotle believed that philia, that friendship love, was a significant portion, a central component of a flourishing and virtuous life. And they emphasized its importance in fostering human well-being and moral character and everything. Friendship was key. That was what everything came from. So it was very central to the culture, and there was nothing more important than being a good friend. So what is the price of friendship? To answer that, I'm going to talk about two obstacles that both Plato and Aristotle saw to becoming friends, to becoming good, deep friends. And this plays into the Christ hymn, believe it or not. I'm going to connect it in a second. Plato and Aristotle talk about the fact that the two people really can't be good, close friends if they lack shared values. If they think different things about very important subjects, they can't really be close friends. I think this, you think this, and it is actually a genuinely important subject. It's going to grate. It's not going to work. That friendship can't be seriously deep, and the Greeks wanted serious, deep friendships. So we have that problem. A lack of alignment in those areas can make it very difficult to establish those strong bonds. They have fundamentally different values and aspirations and different principles that they live by. It's going to be very difficult to establish those bonds. You can relate to that, right? Because you've had people in your life where you got to a certain point in the friendship, and then you just couldn't quite go any further because there were certain conversations where it didn't work. And close friends want to have those close conversations, and it was like, oh, we don't see eye to eye on this. So a different mindset hinders having a very close friendship. So how does Paul address this? Well, think about the lead-in to the Christ hymn. Be of one mind, unity, take on the mind of Christ. Have the same mindset. Think about the important things the same way. Okay? He's talking about that shared mindset. This dispels that. He knows that the Greeks have a problem with wanting to be friends. And Paul knows that Jesus wants us not only to see him as Lord and God, but also as a friend. Jesus wants to be there for us when we need consolation. He wants to be able to be there when we pray to a friend. And the Greeks are saying, but I can't be friends. I don't have the shared mindset. So Paul is saying, have a shared mindset. Get through that. The second obstacle, though, is far more difficult. And it takes a little bit of cleverness by Paul to help the Greeks get through this obstacle. The second obstacle is inequalities in class. The Greeks believed that if you were of a different social class, you couldn't possibly be close friends. For similar reasons that what we just discussed. But it's a little bit further than that. If you were a merchant, you thought about certain things. Your worldview was of a merchant. You could really only be a close friend with another merchant. The master could not be friends with the slave. They thought about different things. There were different priorities. Royalty could only be friends with royalty. Royalty couldn't possibly be friends with a commoner. They just thought about fundamentally different things. That inequality, the fact that they were of a different class just completely wiped out the idea that a Greek could be a friend with another person from a different class, especially if they were in vastly different classes. And how different is God from us? Infinite. You remember the word from last week. He's infinitely different. So how much of a struggle must this have been to the Greeks? Paul is saying, Jesus wants to be your friend, but he's infinitely different from me. You don't understand, Paul. Paul does understand. He understands all of these cultures very well. He's a Roman citizen. He knows Greek culture. He's a Jew. He knows all these different cultures. He knows what they're going through, and he walks them through how to overcome this inequality problem. So remember when I said that I used to think that equality with God was not a thing to be grasped. And that meant that we couldn't even understand the nature of God because he was so infinitely different. That plays into this. How much more different can we possibly be from God? He's infinite. But it's God's desire to be friends with us, and Paul wants to walk them through. So how does he do this? To figure this out, we look at the hymn itself. I'm not going to put it back on the screen. I'm just going to walk you through the concepts. We walked through it twice. You should remember it, at least a little bit. So Paul wants them to be close and overcome that barrier of intimacy with God. So Paul describes the descent that Jesus goes through to come down to us. There's a word, condescension. When a human being is condescending to you, that's a bad thing. When God condescends, con meaning with, descend meaning come down, that's a good thing. Jesus has condescended to be with us, and the Word became flesh. So first, he becomes man, the incarnation. Boom. Took care of the infinite gap right away. God is now man. Jesus is now man. He's still of a different class. If he comes with all of his power, he stays more powerful than any royalty, any political leader, any military leader. He could stay at the top of the heap forever. What was the temptation in the desert all about? The devil wanted to have him stay up there, unrelatable to us, unapproachable. But he said no. He takes upon the form of a commoner, of a servant. He empties himself of that and becomes a servant and a slave. And then through obedience, he even dies on a cross. Now that is the absolute lowest level of society. Absolute lowest level. So he's come right down through it. But now we have a flipped problem. None of us are that low. It's not just that the person we want to be friends with can't be higher than us, it also can't be lower than us. So we've got this problem is now in reverse. None of us are at the point where we're being crucified on a cross. So we're not in the same class. So how do we overcome this? This is the secret of Paul's message. This is the secret of the Christ hymn. This is the secret of him saying, put on the mind of Christ. And then he describes what the mind of Christ is, which is the Christ hymn. We can meet Jesus down there. We can humble ourselves. We can willingly decide to serve and become a slave. We can willingly decide to suffer and to sacrifice for others and meet him at the cross. We can do that. And now we're the same class. And we can walk up hand in hand and say, we're the same. We're brothers. We can voluntarily humble ourselves and meet him there. While still maintaining our dignity, while still maintaining our self-esteem, we can serve and suffer and sacrifice. None of us, if he had stayed at the top, none of us have, unless you've got something up your sleeve I don't know about, none of us could possibly be higher than royalty and meet him up there. None of us. But we can all decide to humble ourselves and serve others and sacrifice for others and take on the mind of Christ and be of the same class. This was especially important to the Greeks, that Paul explains all this, because then they could pick up on the idea of being friends with Jesus. In our modern culture, we there's the songs, I'm a friend of Jesus, and so we don't have the same kind of thing to overcome. But it does add some texture to the idea that we can be close to God, that we can be closer, that we can be of the same class, that we can walk over and hold his hand. Does it not? So Paul, helping the Greeks 2,000 years ago, helps us today. This attitude of service, the willingness to sacrifice, is key. Through humility, meeting him at the cross, we can get that low and meet him there. This is what I meant last week, that Paul is going to use a key aspect of ancient Greek culture to give us a better understanding of our relationship with Jesus. Did I live up to that boast from last week? Good. Because that's what Paul was trying to get through to the Philippians through the Christ hymn, or at least one of the things. There's so many different ways to look at the Christ hymn. So I'm focusing on this one because this one really appealed to me and I wanted to share this. But there's other things as well. Let's go past this and finish up. I think I've got either 2 or 3 more slides, and then we're going to stop. Remember, we're not going to end with Timothy and Epaphroditus. We're going to save that for next week. So we're going to end. Well, we're going to end when I say we're going to end. When we get to the last slide and I say this is it, that's when we're going to end. Okay? We're going to end when I say we're going to end. Okay? That's the service. That's the humility. We're going to say we're going to end when. I'm really bad. Okay. So on to the first verse after the Christ hymn. And notice the first couple of words here. So then, my beloved. So then indicates that Paul is not starting a new topic. He's flowing out from the Christ hymn. This flows out from what he was just talking about. Even though I went on this long thing about Greek culture, we're just right in a flow here. So then, my beloved, obedient as you have always been, not only when I am present, but all the more now when I am being absent, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. One of those lines from Paul we all know. This one is fun. And this actually connects with a verse that I completely skipped over last week, which is another very important verse from Paul. And the way the slides were structured, I talked about the top part, and then I just hit forward, and I missed one really, really important verse from Paul, which was, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work in you will continue to complete it until the day of Christ Jesus. That's chapter 1, verse 6. And I just completely missed it last week. I apologize. But this connects in. Look at everything after the underline. For God is the one who, for his good purpose, works in you, both to desire and to work. This is very similar to the verse underneath it. Paul is promising the Philippians that God will stay with you. God's grace, God's help. He will always be there with you. I am confident he will stay with you until the day of Christ Jesus, until judgment day. However, you must work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You still have a job to do. But I promise you, God will stay with you. When you need to lean on him, he will be there. But you need to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. This would have been, if Paul believed in once saved, always saved, all you need to do is be baptized and say, I believe in God, and that's it. If he believed in once saved, always saved, this would be the absolutely perfect place for him to say, and Jesus went through all this for you, and that's it, you're fine. It'd be the perfect place. But he doesn't. He says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. We have to continue to do our part. We have to continue to cooperate with God. There is no once saved, always saved. By the way, that your own salvation, work out your salvation, that your is plural. He's talking to the community as a whole. Because though we each have to work on our own things for our salvation, we also depend on each other as a community. So it's work out your salvation. Each one of you and group. Both and. Paul is good at that. Both and. Now, I'm going to show you just one part of the footnote that comes from the St. Ignatius Study Bible. Just one part of the footnote on work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Just one part. Okay? This is on working out your ongoing salvation. The footnote reads, while our initial salvation had nothing to do with our works, Ephesians 2, our final salvation depends on a lifetime of keeping the faith, 2 Timothy 4, following the commandments, Matthew 19, persevering in good works, Romans 2, striving for holiness, Hebrews 12, praying in earnest, 1 Thessalonians 5, and fighting against the forces of evil, Ephesians 6, and fighting against the selfish demands of the flesh which drag us down, Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 9. That's just one part of a great footnote. Okay? If you really wanted to dig in and say, what does it mean to work out my salvation with fear and trembling? Just start turning to these different verses, and different authors will give you different insights as to what that means to be constantly working with God in this beautiful, infinite adventure we have here in order to make it to the infinite reward. It's beautiful. The footnote, by the way, continues. Says, this obligation to work out your salvation, this obligation is so serious that we pursue it with fear and trembling. In other words, with a sense of awe at serving the living God and a sense of dread at the prospect of sinning against him. Exodus 20, Psalm 2, and Psalm 2. So fear and trembling doesn't mean living every day with anti-anxiety meds because I'm freaked out. That's not what fear and trembling means, okay? It's used very often in the Old Testament, this idea of fear and trembling, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The awe of recognizing the infinite gulf between God and us and the fact that he infinitely loves us and he infinitely knows what's best for us. If I believe in that, think about all the Psalms you hear where he says, I rejoice in your laws. I rejoice in what you tell me. This is what the fear and the trembling is. I rejoice in the fact that the infinite is giving me advice on how to live life and how to get to him. That's what working out your salvation with fear and trembling means. He's working with me. I've got an infinite task and I've got an infinite helper and he's always going to be with me. That's fear and trembling. It's just a scriptural way to say profound awe, profound reverence in the presence of God or working with God. Next one. Did I finish that? Yes, I did. So Philippians 2:14 through 16. Do everything without grumbling or questioning. Now, that word questioning, it's an acceptable translation, but a slightly better translation would be arguing. Okay? You can imagine think about various conversations you've had with people. People can question you, or you can question other people in a very nice way, or you can question them in an argumentative way. So what that questioning means is that argumentative way. And Paul doesn't like disunity. He's saying, do everything without grumbling or arguing amongst yourselves. I want you to be unified. Unity is above everything for Paul. So this is what he's saying. We're supposed to have that koinonia, that partnership, that shared mindset, that shared mission, and you get rid of the arguing and the grumbling. So, and then he continues on and says, do everything without grumbling or questioning, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. I love that line. I just love it. It's so poetic. It's so beautiful. I don't like living in a perverse and crooked generation, or crooked and perverse. I don't like living in a crooked and perverse generation, but I love the fact that it can be summed up so clearly in just a few words. I mean, is that just beautiful, isn't it? Paul didn't come up with that. That comes from, I don't have it in my notes. I think it's Deuteronomy 20, verse 5, I think. Okay? So it was used back then, and it's also quoted elsewhere in the Old Testament. So that line comes way before Paul, but Paul very often goes to Scripture for his references. Very often does it. I just love that line. Okay? Even though I don't like living in it. It's just beautiful. So he goes on and says, I want you to be blameless in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine like lights in the world, because we hold on to the word of life. That's what we're called to do. Just like the apostles are sent. We go to Mass on the weekend because that comes from the Latin, et missa est, right? You're now sent. Like the apostles, we are sent. We are sent to shine like lights in the world. As you hold on to the word of life, as you hold on to God's objective truth, and you fight back against all the lies in the world, and you shine, and you bring that truth out. That's what we're called to do in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Just as a quick pitch, if you've ever thought about helping in that regard and helping the next generation with the word, with taking to them the word of life and shining like lights in their eyes. If you've ever thought about perhaps volunteering to be a catechist or an assistant at CCD, you might want to talk to the new DRE and say, if you need my help, I'm there. Maybe you're not up for teaching. Maybe you're just up there to help a teacher. But they need bodies. They need people that love their faith, that want to help the kids. So if that's in your heart, that you want to do what Paul is saying, contact the DRE. And that's the end of my pitch. That was just quick because we were there. Now we're on the last slide. And I told you, it's going to end when I say it ends. So we're right there, right now. Okay? But even if I am poured out as a libation upon the sacrificial service of your faith. A libation in Old Testament times would be pouring out wine either over the sacrifice or on the ground or on the altar. I can't remember which. But when you're poured out, the pouring out of a libation is part of the sacrificial offering to God. So he's saying, even if I'm put to death, even if I don't see you again, even if I am poured out as a libation upon the sacrificial service of your faith, when you live out the mind of Christ, you, by definition, you serve, because that is the mind of Christ. And acting it out is where we know that we've adopted the worldview. That is what belief means. If you say you believe in Christ, you serve to some extent. We all have different places in our life. We serve in different ways. But that heart needs to be there, because that heart, that think place, your gut needs to be there because you want to serve. That's what Jesus wants to do. So even if I am poured out as a libation upon the sacrificial service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with all of you. He's going to rejoice because the community is flourishing, and that's the priority, not the fact that he's going to die. And then, as a friend, writing to other friends, consoling his friends because he might be dying, in the same way, you should also rejoice and share your joy with me. Consoling his friend perhaps in advance. We don't know if Paul got out this time. This might have been the last time he was in prison. He might have had a reunion. We don't know. But that's that. As we close here, because that's the last slide. As we close here, I'm going to encourage you one last time to go home tonight after we finish, take out your Bible, go to Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. That's the Christ hymn. And just read it. And pray to God saying, please, if there was something that wasn't discussed tonight, whether now or in the Q&A that we're about to have, if there's something that wasn't discussed tonight, if there's something that you want me in my life, in my circumstance to get out of this, please have it pop off the page to me. And then read it through once or twice and just sit there with God. It's only like 6 or 7 verses. It's not going to take you long. Just sit there and ask God to have that pop out at you. If there's something, on a personal note, by the way, on a personal note, if you do that and you pray with that and something pops out at you and you think it's profound, please drop me an email and share that with me. I'd really be curious if there's something that pops out and goes, wow, this came out. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear I'm not asking you to write me a book. Just, you can if you want to, but just a sentence or two. This is what popped out. I didn't think about this, and this is just what popped out at me. I'd love to hear it. So until we see each other again next Thursday, have a blessed week. That's the end of where we're stopping on Philippians 2. That's it.